Visit us at Eduvvo. Thank you for calling Eduvvo.
With CSS, any element can have a background color or image applied, and certain properties affect how the background of an element appears. In this deep dive, we'll explore basic CSS background properties for applying color, images, positioning, and more. Let's dive in. Every HTML element has a background layer that is transparent by default, but can be filled with a color, image, or a gradient. In an element, everything except the margin area is considered the background. In our HTML file, we have a div with the class box, which is what we'll be using to apply the different background properties. So let's go over the background properties available along with the values they accept. First up, the background color property sets the background color of an element. We covered color values thoroughly in the Values in Units deep dive. So here we'll just go over the types of values and color models the background color property accepts. Like any of the CSS color properties, we can use one of the predefined color names, such as blue. The color value can be one of the 16 basic predefined keywords that represent a common color, as well as the extended color keywords supported by popular browsers. We can also use hex values in our background color property. Also RGBA and RGB values. And finally, HSL or HSLA color values. If we don't specify a background color, the element by default will have a transparent background like we saw earlier. Next, the background image property sets the background image displayed in an element. Background images are specified with a URL value, which uses the URL functional notation to tell the browser where to find the image. The URL we specify can be optionally enclosed with either single or double quotes, and can also contain whitespace before or after the optionally quoted URL. We'll go ahead and add this textured background image to our div. So in our CSS, we'll go ahead and specify the image, which is named bg.png. When we refresh the browser, there we see our textured background image applied. If the image we specify cannot be displayed, for example, the URL doesn't load or the image no longer exists in the directory, the browser will treat the background image as if its value was none, and it will display a transparent background. Since the background layer is drawn beneath the image layer by the browser, it's good practice to also specify a background color that will preserve the contrast with any content you might have, just in case the image is not available or the user has disabled images in the browser. So let's go ahead and choose a hex value that closely matches the overall hue of our background image. So now that we have the background color value, if the image is not able to load, the color will be displayed behind our background image as a fallback. By default, a background image is repeated or tiled both horizontally and vertically so that it covers the entire element. Since the image we're using is about the same size as our div here, about 800 by 500 pixels, we're not seeing it repeat. So let's go ahead and use a different textured background image that's 200 by 200 pixels. As we can see here, the image is cropped on each side so that it seamlessly tiles when the image is repeated. I downloaded this image at subtlepatterns.com, which is a great resource for downloading free patterns and textures to use as background images in your designs. Back in our CSS, we'll go ahead and add the new image, which is called BG tiled. So now when we refresh the browser, we see our perfectly tiled background image in our div. And we'll once again change the background color to match the hue of the background image with a light gray hex value. Background images are generally used for decorative things like textures, list markers, buttons, and icons, sometimes as a full-page background image on a website or a header. If the image is part of the actual content and conveys important information, for example, the main image of a news article or contextual blog post images that relate to the content, then it's best to include it as an inline image element in the markup. That way we can specify things like alt text if the image for some reason does not load. Later in the advanced background video, we'll learn how we can create multi-layered background images by specifying several background images at once. We can control whether or not the image is tiled and exactly how it gets tiled, both vertically and horizontally, with the background repeat property. For this example, we'll change the background image so we can see exactly how it repeats in the background. The default value for background repeat is repeat. The background image is repeated both vertically and horizontally so that it covers the entire background image painting area. Now, if we only want the image to repeat horizontally on the x-axis, we can use the value repeat x. The value repeat y repeats the image vertically on the y-axis. As we can see here, images that are near the edge are clipped if they do not all evenly fit the available area. I'll go ahead and remove the y so we can see this a little better. There are ways to adjust this with newer values like space or round, but at the time of this recording, browser support for these is still poor, even in Chrome. For more information on these new values, visit the W3C's latest module for backgrounds and borders at w3.org. If we do not want our background images to repeat or tile, we'll need to use the value no repeat. So as we can see, no repeat places the image once in the top left corner, and it does not repeat it in any direction. By default, a background image's initial position is the top left-hand corner of the containing element, as we can see here. We can control this position with the background position property, which accepts position keywords along with length units and percentages. The first value in background position determines the position in the x-axis or horizontal position. So here we'll use the keyword center, which positions the image in the center of the containing element. Other x-axis keywords are left and right. The second value determines the y-axis or vertical position in the image. But if just one value is specified, like we have now, the browser will assume that the second value is center. So here we see that the image is perfectly centered inside of the div. If we add a second value of top, the image is now positioned at the top of the div, and the value bottom positions the image at the bottom of the div. When we use percentages, the values are relative to the height and the width of the positioning area. So now the image is positioned 80% to the left and is still vertically centered at 50%. If we use a negative value, the offset goes outward from the edge of the background positioning area as opposed to inward. So now the image is minus 100 pixels from the left side and still vertically centered. With the background attachment property, we can determine whether or not the background image scrolls along with the containing element and content, or if it stays fixed to the viewport area and never moves. So we'll switch over to a new HTML file containing 3 divs, and I've added the classes scroll, fixed, and local. We'll add the different background attachment values according to their class names, so we can see how these work in comparison to each other. When we scroll a page, the viewport never moves. It's stationary. What actually moves up and down is the content on the page. In the background attachment property, scroll is the default value. The background image scrolls within its containing element, so it moves up and down the page along with everything else. So we'll go ahead and select our div with the class scroll, add the background attachment property with the value scroll. As we can see in our scroll div, when the page is scrolled, the background image also scrolls along with the content. But like I said, this is the initial value for background attachment, so we can actually leave it out and it will work the same way. The value fixed keeps the image fixed to the viewport so that it doesn't scroll with the page. So go ahead and change scroll to select our div with the class fixed. And when we refresh, we can see that when we used fixed, we're telling the browser that when a user scrolls up and down the page, the image should stay where it is and not scroll with the content or page. So it remains fixed to the viewport. A new value recently introduced in the W3C's Backgrounds and Borders Level 3 module is local. So we'll first go ahead and select our local div, and we'll add the background attachment property along with the value local. When background attachment local is applied, the background image is positioned relative to the element's content. So as we can see, the background scrolls with the page content, and it also scrolls when the containing element is scrolled. So the image is fixed to the element and its content. The value local is not yet supported in Firefox at the time of this recording, but Safari, Chrome, Opera, and IE9 and above do support it. Finally, instead of having to write each of the individual CSS declarations every time we want to use a background color, image, position, and so forth, we can instead merge all of them into one shorthand property, the background property. When using the background shorthand property, the common order for the property values is background color, background image, background repeat, background attachment, and the background position properties. Now we can go ahead and remove these individual background properties above. It really doesn't matter if one or several of the values are left out, as we don't have to specify every value, only the ones we need. For the values that are left out, the default values will be used instead by the browser. Designers and developers use CSS backgrounds in just about every project, so it's good to get familiar with each of the different background properties and values available. In the next video, we'll learn how we can create rounded and elliptical corners with the border radius property.